Terrific. Well, thank you all. Maybe this translated as some of you were entering the room that this is very much a meeting of friends and colleagues. Bo Young Lee is somebody I've known for a little over a decade now, 12 years. Fun fact, Bo gave me advice on my very first marathon. And so amongst the many other things that Bo taught me, some tips on marathon running is one of them. But onward to this esteemed panel. I'll quickly reintroduce myself. I'm Dina Fidas, the managing director here at Out and Equal. My pronouns are she and her. And one of the elements of the portfolio I oversee is with our key stakeholder partners. You heard from Disability In, you've heard in the past from Gender Cool. Every year we focus in on those peers in our world who do similar work across lines of diversity. And we look to these partners in this work for support, for inspiration, and sometimes we also get to lend our support for the work as well. Beginning about a year ago, when some of the most, I think, virulent anti-Asian sentiment was being expressed from the highest levels of office in this country, Ascend had reached out, and we were very honored to be a part of various efforts over the last year. Awareness raising would be an understatement. I think before I hand the mic over to Anna Mok, who leads Ascend, and Michelle Meow, and this incredible panel, is to say that if you do nothing else, if you remember no other detail of this part of ExFo, I hope you will remember that fire in your belly, that sense of shock and anger and grief at the events of this last year in the form of hate speech, hate crimes, harassment and violence, that doesn't just sit as fire in your belly, but it evolves and it grows into a sustained commitment, and one that can then translate into actually a joyful commitment to fundamentally change the conversations that you are a part of within your organizations when it comes to AAPI inclusion. And so out of these tragedies, out of this anger, I hope that we can come to a place where we are sustaining each other, and that this work continues to be a labor of honoring one another in the workplace and honoring the fullness of the experiences that we bring to the table. So with that, again, thank you. Thank you to all of you on the panel, the companies and organizations that you represent, and all that you are doing to move everyone forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dina. And with that, let's get into it. I'm going to turn the mic right over to our fabulous moderator for this conversation, Michelle Meow. Many of you may know Michelle Meow is the host and producer of the Michelle Meow Show. His tagline is your A to Z, covering the LGBT, LMNOP, and everything in between. Michelle also produces the programs at the iconic Commonwealth Club in San Francisco. And we are just thrilled to have her moderate this panel conversation today. And so with that, I'll turn it over to you, Michelle, to introduce our panelists as well.
Thank you so much, Dina, and thank you so much, Isabel. Thank you all for joining us and having me. I want to first send some warm wishes to those celebrating holidays in the Southeast Asian and South Asian communities. I'm Lao, so in our culture, we say, Sok Di Pi Mai. So thank you. Our speakers today on this incredible panel, our executives, include Kenrick Ross, who's an executive director of the National Queer Asian Pacific Islander Alliance, also known as NQAPIA. We have Anna Mok, who's the president and co-founder of Ascend and partner at Deloitte Touche LLP. And finally, Bo Young Lee, who's Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer for Uber Technologies. I think we'll begin by first asking each of our executives to share their own personal experiences of anti-Asian hate and or racism within the workplace or your respective roles or positions, maybe perhaps an incident in which you've carried with you but have not necessarily have shared so openly. We'll start with Bo.
Yes, so, you know, I've been trying to be very transparent actually about the experiences that I've had, in large part because I think that part of the model minority myth and part of what we get conditioned as Asian Americans is to hide our struggle, right? I'm Korean American, and my pronouns are she, her, they. And there's actually a value in Korea called chamki. And chamki literally means to endure. And it means to endure your physical, your emotional, your psychological pain. And it's something that is really placed upon all Koreans. Like you're told from a very young age, chamo, chamo, like endure it, endure it. And it's especially something that is used oftentimes to gaslight women within the Korean American community to tell us you have a special responsibility as a female to endure. And so I've been sharing a lot of stories, and there's this, like, I mean, I've had horrible experiences, probably the worst experience I've ever had with AAPI harassment and threat, where I literally thought I was going to get physically beaten up or even killed. I was on the tube in London, of all places, and this group of young white British men decided that they didn't like me very much, and they got right up into my face and started screaming at me about how much I'm destroying their country and how much I'm, it's all because of my people that the country is collapsing, and they're blaming me for all of the like failures of like the UK. And I guess they thought I was like Chinese, British, or something along those lines. And I was like, didn't say anything, and there were a lot of other people. No one intervened. None of the bystanders helped. And they kept getting closer and closer, and they kind of looked like skinheads. And finally, I just opened my mouth, and in the most American sounding accent that I could like create, like I literally tried to make myself sound like someone from like Peoria, Illinois, right? Like really American. I said, when you say you people, are you referring to tourists who come here and spend their money in your country? Or by you people, like, I'm like, I don't understand. I want you to articulate to me exactly who you people, because they were calling me chink and all this kind of stuff, but like, I wanted them to be really clear. And I think they were caught off guard by my accent. And that just de-escalated the whole entire situation. But I was really frightened, but I was proud of myself for having the wherewithal to like stay calm, because I know that that's what they wanted. They wanted the fear there. But even more so than that experience, since the beginning of this pandemic, there has been a much more minor, almost hilariously minor incident that happened to me in early March of 2020 that has lingered with me even to this day. And I think it's because that incident actually made a space that for me used to be very safe suddenly very unsafe. So it was the weekend before New York City made an official shutdown order. And I knew that it was coming. The shutdown order was coming. So I tried to squeeze in one last yoga class at my local yoga studio. And I go to a kind of a fancy yoga studio that smells like eucalyptus. And it's all like, pretty wood and brown wood. And they were already social distancing at that point. So they'd already laid out all the mats, and I got there and I kind of plopped myself down on one of the mats. And this woman behind me, I hear her whispering to somebody behind me. And then suddenly, very loudly, she says to me, "Can you move?" And I turn around and I go, "Are you talking to me?" She goes, "Yes." "Can you move?" And I go, "Why?" And she goes, "Well, this whole COVID thing and everything, and I don't want to really breathe in your air." And I go, "What's wrong with my air?" And she goes, "COVID, we should be social distancing." And I go, "Well, I am. Like, I sat in a mat that the studio put down." And she goes, "But like you're in front of me now. And so the air flows from the front to the back. And so like, I'm going to breathe in your air." And I go, again, like, "What's wrong with my air?" And then she's like, "I don't know why you're being so rude. Like, I'm just asking you politely." And I said, "Here's the thing. There's a person next to you, there's a person behind you, and there's another person next to you. You haven't asked any of them to move, but you're asking me. And I can't help but notice that I'm the only person of Asian descent in this room. So I think you're racially profiling me and you're racially harassing me." And she goes, "Oh, how dare you accuse a fellow yogi of being racist?" And I said to her, "Well, how dare you racially profile and harass a fellow yogi?" I said, "Unless you ask the rest of the people around you to move, I'm not moving." And finally she got up and she moved. And, I reported her, and I think I actually got her kicked out of that studio. But I still think about that because I actually went back to that studio a couple of weeks ago when New York City allowed for fitness classes, and I felt suddenly very unsafe, and I didn't want to go back. And so I probably will look for a new studio going forward. And it was just, it's such a, in the grand scheme of all the hate crimes that have been going on, the harassment that has been going on, this hate speech, it's such a minor experience, but it's like the kind of minor experience of gaslighting that happens so frequently within the AAPI community. And we're told to, like, you know, that chumki, the chamo, endure it, don't let it get to you. But like, why shouldn't I allow that to get to me? So, you know, that's just some of the stuff that's happened to me in the past.
Thank you, Bo. Kenrick?
Hey everyone, I'm Kenrick. My pronouns are he, him, his. I think for me, in most recently stepping into the role at NQAPIA, 8 weeks in, identity and how the wider world likes to pigeonhole or stereotype has really come up, because literally a funder. So I'm sorry I'm not on Zoom because I have a hamstring injury that has left me pretty incapacitated. But before that happened, as a new ED would, I've been making the round of our funders on Zoom to try to build some sort of rapport. And I was surprised when somebody said to me, the first thing they said to me, "Oh, you are not what I was expecting." And I said, "Excuse me." He said, you don't look that Asian." And I said, "Well, okay." And it, I brushed it off but I knew exactly what he was saying. In his view of what the gay Asian ED should look like, because we're the only national LGBTQ API organization, there must be a singular look. I didn't particularly fit in. And I think you become so used to it, like Bo was saying, you're expected to just brush those things off. And sometimes you do. And part of the role of being an ED is putting yourself in these unsafe situations. But it has been mentioned several times to me, well, what is API? And I feel that one of the things that we don't kind of zero in on is the multiple identities that API Americans can hold. So, for example, I'm from the Asian Caribbean, what we are now calling the Asian Caribbean. I'm Indo-Caribbean. I'm also mixed race. I'm also partly Black. I think it's important that I am one of the people that somebody looks at Zoom and said, that's also a vision that I can see as an API person with those multiple identities. So those are kinds of like microaggressions of what are you? Similarly, where are you from? Although you may be from the United States. And it's not just in my professional life. I think of, I'm an immigrant. I came to New Jersey in the late 1980s. And at that time, there was a gang called the Dot Busters. And what they would do is to go around and beat up South Asian youth. This is what they did. And there was such anxiety to not appear South Asian in the Guyanese community, in the Indian community, in the Bangladeshi community, which is very prominent in this part of New Jersey. And it just made you realize how, from an age of like 8, you're targeted, because these are one of your identities. And this is, led to how you're targeted as an immigrant. I went an entire year in high school. I did not speak in a single class because the teacher kept asking me to repeat myself, and then said to me, "You should have taken ESL." Although the country I'm from, English is the only language I speak. Unfortunately, English is still the only language I speak. So you have those situations, and this was the 1990s. Those comments will no longer happen in schools, but they will happen in different ways. And they will happen in the same way that somebody feels empowered to say to you when you pop onto Zoom, you don't fit my expectations of what a continent of dozens of countries and its diasporas can look like.
Thank you so much, Kenrick. And finally, Anna.
Thank you, Bo and Kendrick. Those stories just, they bring back so much in our hearts and in our bodies as we think through all of the incidences, right, we've each experienced in our lifetime. I'm just gonna kind of share a few, and maybe it is a self-introduction at the same time. So I live in San Francisco, like Michelle, in the Bay Area, and so this is one of the most diverse and liberal cities in the world, probably. And but I grew up with a lot of things that seem contra to that. My family's first home was in a predominantly Black neighborhood, and that's still the home my dad, who's 88 now, chooses to live in. So when I was growing up, I was beat up all the time. I would call names. I was, picked on. There was this little group of Asian kids that were just moving into that neighborhood. We banded together, but we could by no means protect each other. And we just took it. We never complained to the teacher. We didn't even go home to tell our parents because we didn't want our parents to worry about them needing to work and leaving us at home to fend for ourselves. So all of that, and I didn't grow up understanding what all that meant. It kind of was, Black kids, and that time, Black kids beating us up. It wasn't until I went to Cal and studied ethnic studies and really kind of processed and understood what kind of system we were in, that we create that kind of sentiments with classmates that are really, I think, kind-hearted and well-intended as humans, yet they needed to lash out at someone. And we were the ones that they lashed out at, right? We were the ones moving into the community. We were the ones seemingly the good minority getting all the good grades, the teacher's pets. We were the ones that maybe had two parents in our households, right? And had food on the table. So that kind of story, and I've been in the last year, but in particular the last month since the Atlanta shootings, been in so many company conversations in my Ascend role, hearing stories from their employees, and so many stories of all of us being subjected to that kind of abuse, physical and verbal, in our childhoods. And what the recent acts have brought back is almost a degree of PTSD, right? We kind of put all those aside as we went into adult life, and we accept it. We accept that that is what we have to take as Americans, right? Or as immigrants. You come as immigrants into the country and you just think that is the norm. That is just the norm of how we as humans, Americans, treat each other. You just take it, you accept it, you don't talk about it, you don't complain about it, you don't even report it when your family, when there's a physical crime against you, or when someone burglarizes your house, because you don't want to put attention on that. That is such a strong part of our community. And even for those of us, I use the story of me having privilege, and all of us at this meeting have privilege. Because we have privilege because I assume most of our audience is educated and we have jobs. That in itself is a privilege. Even those of us with some privilege have all of that in our everyday lives. And then I think about my father. One reason I'm back in San Francisco, I used to live just right outside the suburbs, is to be closer to my father, who's 88, still living in that house in a very, very diverse neighborhood. Stop driving. The only way you can get out is take the bus. He is literally right now a prisoner in his own home. My brother and I do not let him get out of his house. We literally like check in on him and make sure he doesn't go out of his house. Can you imagine you're in your 80s, you've been in this country, you've raised your kids, you've paid taxes, you didn't make a lot of money, but you now are at the place in life where you should be at the optimal of your freedom, to the extent you only have a few more years of physical freedom. He cannot do that at all. And I share that because so many in our workforces, in our companies, have a father like mine, are worrying about our fathers, are worrying about our children that are needing to go back to school and not sure if, how are you going to be in school and how are people going to look at them? How are people going to talk to them? And are they going to talk about my child's air polluting theirs? That is real in terms of what our community is feeling. And it's completely tied to, I know we'll talk a little bit more about it, this whole concept of the model minority myth, which Bo and I have talked about. And that myth is so strong in how people believe, but most people don't even understand it or know it and don't even know the words of it. Even Asians don't. And that myth is what causes and actually creates even more silence than what is already culturally inherent in how we show up at work. That myth tells us we should be obedient and quiet and grateful, and we should not complain, and we should be happy. One of the saddest stories I recently heard from a colleague of mine was, I was sharing with him, and I've been trying to actually, within my own organization, just have more dialogue, right, around this and enlighten. And a colleague of mine, who I've only known physically as a short hair South Asian man who's in tech, all the stereotypes you see. And he was thanking me for having these conversations because he said, well, I'm chic, right? I said, no, I didn't know. He goes, yeah. I go, well, why? And, I come from people that wear turbans and have long hair. I go, well, what happened? Why aren't you? He goes, well, I changed all that because that is the only way I can have fit in, feel like I can advance, and also actually be safe, especially after 9/11. So the fact that people have to feel like they have to give up something so core to that identity in order to survive and make a living in this country is something we all have to pause on.
Thank you so much, Anna and Bo and Kenrick, for sharing your personal stories. We've got a lot to cover, and so the next series of questions that I'll ask or call on one of you, but if any of you want to add in addition to a speaker, please feel free to do so. Bo, what challenges or roadblocks might you face as an AAPI executive when you're leading on issues like anti-Asian racism and hate?
It's interesting. Up until maybe 5 years ago, I think I may have been one of 2 or 3 leaders in the DEI space who was of Asian American descent or API descent. There were very few of us. And I always remember being asked the question, oh, that's interesting. You don't see too many Asians in this field. And I go, and I would always ask, why do you think that is? And people always would oftentimes say, oh, I just assume because you don't have any issues. Your community doesn't face any real discrimination. Your community is doing pretty well overall. And I think that encapsulates a lot of the misunderstanding that exists around the AAPI community. Overall, the narrative has always been, here's a group of people, here's a group of people who seem to be doing very well. And like people always like to point out, well, Indian and Chinese Americans have the highest family income of all racial ethnic groups in the United States, even compared to white people. And that is indeed the truth. Although I also like to point out to people that though they do have the highest family income, white families still have the highest overall net worth. And that's a strong byproduct of generational wealth that gets passed down, which immigrants don't have generational wealth. But I also like to point out that yes, while we might be on one end of the barbell, on the other end of the barbell, we also represent the lowest family income of any racial ethnic group, with like families of Vietnamese, Cambodian, Laotian, Hmong communities. And this narrative of AAPI community being the wealthiest, being okay, masks so much of what we're seeing in the Asian American community, and masks the struggle that we do actually face. And one of the things that really came to light very early on, I mean, I said the other day to a colleague, I said to a colleague the other day, in the 20 years that I've been doing this work, I can count on one hand the number of times a company, a client, when I used to be in consulting, a company or a client has asked me to actually create a program or to do create some effort focused on the AAPI community. It's just not something that was ever part of the corporate diversity and inclusion conversation. And Anna can talk about this at great length, because that's what Ascend does, is try to draw attention to this. But I myself, I have this great body of knowledge that for decades, literally, I never really had to, was asked to talk about. And then at the beginning of COVID, it was a really interesting experience for me, because I had so many of my peers in the DEI space, people who are very learned, very experienced, very thoughtful, D&I leaders who reached out to me kind of secretly and said, Bo, here's the real deal. I know nothing about your community. I really have no idea. I don't understand it. I don't understand the history of it. And I realized that I'm speaking up, and I'm taking ownership for my ignorance. Can you help me understand that journey? And I took several of my peers, people that I've used as mentors over the years, and said, okay, I'm happy to help you. And I began walking through, and at one point, I shared some of my personal stories of racism. I shared the story about what happened to me in London. I've shared other things, my earliest experience of being called a chink at the age of 4. And I remember one of the chief diversity officers of a very large company says to me, she goes, I just never knew. I never knew that there was any anti-Asian racism in this country. I did not know you were called slurs all the time. I did not know that, your name gets screwed up all the time. And, and she's like, shame on me for not knowing that. And I go, well, but yeah, maybe if you work in the space, you should know a little bit about it, but that means that white supremacy is working. I said, your ignorance of the AAPI community tells me that you have internalized some white supremacy, because that's what white supremacy, the model minority myth was created by white supremacy to, segregate the Asian community from other communities of color. And the fact that other communities of color had no awareness about us means that it worked really, really successfully. So, yeah, I think it's been an interesting journey to be an AAPI leader in this period of time. And I didn't even realize how ignorant people were until really last year.
Anna or Kenrick, would you like to add? I feel like, it keeps coming up. We are throwing the MMM model minority myth out there. So now's also a good time to continue the conversation around that.
Yeah, just building a bit on what Bo's saying, I think this issue of so little knowledge about the community and how deep-seated these beliefs and perceptions are. As this team knows, Ascend does a lot of research work too, shining light on the reality of Asian Americans in the workplace. And if you look at those statistics, it's undisputed. We are not doing any better at the most senior ranks of companies, given the context of how many Asians are currently going into the workforce and have been actually for decades. So if you look at middle management on up and onto the boards, it is completely not anywhere near parity relative to workforce. And that is a little known fact. And those are facts and those are numbers. There's no gray about it. But every boardroom, every executive conversation I go into, It's like an aha when I bring that up for some reason. People have not internalized it, back to what Bo was saying, right? People see it very differently, even intelligent people, even people that really we would expect to be much more learned about these issues. And frankly, Bo, including people in talent organizations. And I have been astounded the last couple of months, again, in particular, I get pieces of paper, and again, not to be shared, from what people see in their company policies and processes that say things, this program is for everyone except Asians. Literally, that explicit. It says all X and then put in parentheses, right? Or all non-Asians. Developmental programs. And I pause and think about that. We don't exclude women from programs, even though there's some very high profile women in certain roles, but somehow because we have some Asians, perhaps in high profile roles, like especially in tech, somehow a handful of a few has now represented and is symbolic of the success of the whole. But we don't do that for other communities at all. So that deep-seated thinking is one of the things I am a complete mission to change in my lifetime. I say that I'm not going to close this racial divide, or sorry, get it completely closed, but I do hope I can narrow it before I'm like my dad, right? I'm wanting to just enjoy life and be able to walk in the streets of San Francisco. But it is so deep seated. I didn't even realize that until I really started getting into this work, even more so the last few years.
Kenrick, I know you have a lot to say about model minority myth, and so please jump in.
Sure. To piggyback off of both comments, I think we tend to use a singular lens when we look at indicators often. So without kind of aggregating that different communities are impacted in different ways and different communities have different barriers. So when we look at diversity, for example, in a particular company, we tend to think, what is the percentage of people who are being recruited and who are being retained? And that is often a black and brown conversation. And the counterpoint to that often is, well, you have a lot more Asians, for example, in tech. Tech companies tend to struggle with black and brown employees. If it's a 0.5% increase, it's news. But tech companies tend to, particularly at the highest levels, have this mythology that they're very open to tech, partly because the model minority myth says that Asians are techie. They are quantifiably thinking people, not a qualifiably thinking people. But the conversation should be around what kinds of roles, how are they promoted? Are API folks invited to lead meetings? Are they invited to give presentations? Are they invited to do the things that will put them on the path to positions in those companies? And I always think of Chimamanda Adichie, the Nigerian novelist, and she had a TED talk called The Danger of the Single Story. And we have that in America, where we use a single lens or a single story to evaluate everything. We do the same thing for poverty. We do the same thing for social mobility. And we never break down those numbers, right? We never go into those numbers to say white supremacy or inequity impacts people differently and probably in the ways that are most likely to limit their potential. In some ways, it's an algorithm, right? It's an algorithm that will let certain people be recruited and retained, but never promoted. But it will work differently for other people to keep them out of those jobs. So if it's one thing that I think we have to stop doing is to look at statistics and believe we can evaluate things with one lens. because a lot gets lost, and a lot of both opportunity gets lost, but a lot of, I will call it for what it is, pain and suffering gets lost as well.
I want to jump in here for a moment because there's something that Anna said and also something that Kenrick referred to that I think it's really important to provide some context with. You know, all of us have talked a little bit about white supremacy at this point in time. And I think it's really, I always like to remind people that like white supremacy isn't just about race, right? It is also about like gender. Like white supremacy is like toxically masculine. It is homophobic. It is transphobic. It is anti-Semitic, you know, on top of being just racist, right? And I think so one of the things we really have to do as we start to like unpackage like this moment in time, because I think this moment in time feels extra fraught because we are experiencing, COVID exposed so much of the flaws of every nation. And I said like inequity didn't cause COVID, but inequity became COVID's best friend. It is inequity that allowed for so much of the spread of COVID. You know, we saw this in the United States with the disproportionate impact it had on Black and Brown communities and other, you know, poor communities that don't have access to healthcare or live in small cramped housing. And so I think the entire last year has been just about exposing the underbelly of inequity across the board. And then you had the murder of George Floyd and the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd. And then on top of all of that, you then started this building narrative around AAPI hate. And it just, like a lot of people have said like, good Lord, like, why does it all feel like so much is happening? And I'm so uncomfortable by all of this. And I remember there's this cultural anthropologist down at University of North Carolina, and if I could remember her name, I would state it. But she has this incredible phrase called, "We're in a moment of the democratization of discomfort." And I think it's such a wonderful phrase, because the moment I said it, I'm sure everyone understood exactly what I meant. Meaning historically, when there was oppression, the people who experienced it were the ones who were being oppressed, right? The LGBTQ community, the AAPI, the Black, the Brown, the disabled, the, you know, Jewish, Muslim, you know, older communities, they felt it. And the people of privilege and of relative privilege, they could just kind of float above it. And we're now, and what COVID did, what this last year did, is it democratized discomfort. You can no longer deny, you know, that there isn't inequality, but now that discomfort is pushing people to say, and we all have a responsibility to address it. And some people are like, no, I still don't have a responsibility to address this. This is, you know, that's still the AAPI's problem, or that's still the brown people's problem. So I wanted, like, that's one framework that I think it's really important for people to sort of realize where we are. And the other one is, we have used the term model minority myth many times, but I think people have a very superficial understanding of it, but they don't understand the root of it, right? They don't realize that it's not something that the AAPI community created for itself. Like, if you think as recently as 1945, we had Japanese Americans interned in concentration camps, right? And I use that term deliberately, concentration camps. The term internment camps is language that the white community gave to the Asian community, saying, we put you in internment camps, not concentration camps. But they were in fact actually concentration camps. Like, what do you do? What is it when you take tens of thousands of Japanese Americans, put them in a camp in the middle of the desert without enough supplies? That's a concentration camp. And once the Japanese, you know, once World War II ended and those the concentration camps, you know, were, you know, destroyed, the kind of white supremacy, it wasn't like a verbal agreement, but the white supremacy community basically said, hey, we'll call you the model minority myth if you agree to segregate yourself from the Black and Brown civil rights movement. Because if you become part of the civil rights movement, it'll be unstoppable. But if we can like we'll treat you with a modicum of respect, not full respect, but just a little bit, if you take on this like myth. And the Asian American community in the United States, the Chinese, the Koreans that were here, the Indian American, they're all like, oh, you mean that our risk of being put back into concentration camps go away if we can become the model minority? Oh, we'll take that on for you, right? Because prior to that, like the Asian American community and the Black community and the Brown community, we all worked together towards civil rights. And then something really magical happened in 1965. The Immigration and Nationality Act was passed. Suddenly, we went from having about 20,000 Asian. I think there was like 50,000 Asian Americans prior to that in all of the United States, some very low number. And every year after 1965, you started seeing about 200,000 Asian Americans coming in. And those 200,000 never learned the history prior to 1965. And they assumed model minority myth was something that was real. And so I think it's really important for people to understand that context in the rest of what we're talking about.
Thank you so much, Bo. My heart is singing just because you're touching on so many points that I think in some ways I've even internalized as an individual. For those of you who are here joining us, you'd like to ask a question, you can send them to the chat box and we'll try to get them to our speakers. For time purposes, I'm going to combine like 4 questions. And I think it's along the lines of what we're all asking ourselves, right? Like, what can we do? What do we need to do in the world of diversity and inclusion? Or if you are an executive or you are a leader or in a position of privilege and have access to resources, what are some of the things that we need to be doing like right now in order to have the impact trickle down to our community and of course, the most vulnerable, the most marginalized? Anna?
I'll start. Sometimes as leaders and as people, we want to do these big things. We think we want to change the world. And of course, we want to at the macro level. But sometimes it's a series of really small things that can make a big difference. The first thing I ask everyone to do is just, can you check in with your workforce or your people that you know that are of Asian descent? One of the things that have come through so loudly in all my conversations is it is like crickets. People are not checking in. People are somehow not connecting what's happening and what we see around hate crimes or these incidents back to the fact that it is actually impacting each of us as Asians in the workforce, whether directly because of our family or otherwise. So that immediate genuine check-in means so much because you are telling me you care and I am not invisible to you. You are telling me I'm a human to you. The second thing, and again, these seem like such little things, but they're realities in our community, is can you learn to know my name and see me and remember me? And related to that, actually learn to pronounce my name. Even if you don't know it, try to do that. I've heard so many stories, and myself included. I'm sure if Bo and I were to go to another meeting together, someone's going to call me Bo right after that meeting, even though I'm a little older than her and she's more beautiful than me. I use that jokingly, but there's so many stories of that. And if that happens all the time to you, what does that tell the person? It tells the person that you don't matter. You're just a number. You're invisible to me. Those are some very little things. And then the bigger things I think people can do and leaders can do is, I think we all know what's right and what's wrong. Our heart tells us that. And when we see something, we know that. Our gut tells us that. But we don't always do something about it. So whether you are seeing something that's happening in the workplace, be an upstander, speak up, right? Make an environment in your teams where your team members feel like they can say, that doesn't quite feel right. Can we dig into that a little bit? Or if you see policies or practices in your company that don't seem inclusive, because I've seen so many companies now set up things very well intended to begin with. Just like the term, and I will apologize if I offend anyone, there's been this long-standing term for a while of underrepresented minorities. And very true, certain segments, our Black and Latinx and Indigenous people have a different pipeline issue. Yet to say underrepresented minorities is in itself, I believe, a racist term, even though it's well intended to shine light on trying to be inclusive. So when you see things like that as leaders in your companies, I would probe and ask the question and create the dialogue that then hopefully leads to what in the workplace we really intend to do, which is build a more inclusive workplace for all, and that everyone can benefit from it.
Kenrick?
Sure. So I think there are many parts to a movement, and in terms of what Anna just said, it's everybody knows right from wrong, and we tend to know what we can do within our capacity. It's not about you, or even if you're an executive, much less you are just a worker, you're not going to dismantle white supremacy by yourself. None of us are. If it was that easy to do, we would have done it. But it is going to take 10 million pieces of doing this. And I feel if you're in a company, learning is very important. Learning about these issues and how they're connected. At NQAPIA, I use the term shared communities often, that we don't live in silos. And it's not just the API or the LGBTQ communities that are at the intersection of our work. We live in BIPOC communities. We live in multi-generational communities, things like that. It's very important to learn about these communities if you are going to invest in supporting them. It should be prolonged and sustained. I see this with philanthropy, and I say this often in terms of philanthropy and giving, that if something is of the moment, it gets a lot of attention, it gets a pledge, it gets a sign-on letter, and then you move on to something else. And for the last couple weeks, it's been API hate, as if the Muslim ban was not that. Or the instances in Chinatowns 14 months ago were not that, but it has pierced the bubble. And the way I would say that you are going to help with your learning for your company culture from your staff point of view is hire more API folks, or hire more people who bring different perspectives and put them in the positions where they can make those changes, not just to fill a report on diversity. For example, NQAPIA got a very large donation from MasterCard at the end of last year for our work. And we got that because Shamina Singh and Parag Mehta knew us. They knew the organizations that were part of our federation. But if they were not in that position, they didn't know the work we did and who we supported, and they didn't have a value proposition argument to make, how many people know NQAPIA? Likewise, I'm on this panel probably because Rebecca reached out. If you are going to impact our communities, if you are going to undertake the work, you have to, it's great to bring people in and hear stories or watch videos. That's very important to hear from people like me. But ultimately, if you bring more of us into your organizations and put them in those decision-making positions, your impact would be much greater.
Bo, I'm sure you have some final thoughts to add to that. Especially, I had a question about diversity and inclusion officers, and kind of if the role should evolve in a different priority rank. Something that expands beyond performative statements and representations. And then after you, I do have some questions from our audience, so I want to get to them as well.
Yeah, and I'll try to be as concise as possible, though that's not my strong suit. I would say I think that I think and I'm saying this not because I'm the old lady of the room from a DEI perspective, but I say this because I think the role was a much truer form of itself 10 years ago when there were far fewer DEI officers. And I think part of it is because 10 years ago, to address diversity and inclusion as directly as the few companies that had the role, it took a lot of corporate courage to do it because you were no longer following a trend. A lot of the roles now, I have a fear. There's been a lot of articles written about the DEI role and how it has to be blown up because it's all just, it's just window dressing for a company. And I don't disagree with op-eds that have been written. But I also realize that the op-eds are very short-sighted about how the role could be maximized. I mean, you know, this sounds arrogant, but I like to believe I am one of the more strategic of the DEI leaders, largely because I'm old enough that I don't care anymore. And, you know, one of the things that comes with age, you don't care anymore. You just say whatever's on your mind and you become much more bolder and louder through the process. And, you know, I like to think that, you know, the way that I lead and that a handful of DEI leaders is very strategic and is very something much bigger than performative statements that are out there. But I do worry that, you know, and I've said, because there's been one of my friends in executive recruiting said there's been a threefold increase in companies that are looking for chief diversity officers. There are over 60 new chief diversity officer roles out there. But I wonder if they're truly chief diversity officer roles. Some of these recruiters, when I talk to them and I hear what they say the salary ranges, I'm like, that's barely a director level role, let alone an executive level role. Two, like, you know, I wonder how many of those roles will be there in 2 years. So I think overall, like, I do worry a little bit about the role and the position. And then the second thing is, I do actually think that the role has to change, even for those of us who are leading it strategically. I actually think the role is DEI is one segment of a much larger corporate discussion around corporate ethics and responsibility, not in a governance sort of way, but in a true like ethical, like decision-making, corporate decision-making. I think diverse organizations are more ethical organizations. There's a lot of research around it. So I'd actually love to see chief diversity officers evolve into chief ethics officers in the long term.
Thank you so much. I can't believe we're already out of time. I wish that we had 30 more minutes, but I think one question we'll take from the audience, and Kenrick, you'll answer this question, is how can we learn more about our colleagues and their experiences and their stories, but while avoiding, you know, offending them because of are asking about their cultural heritage?
This is a complex question because I'm very mindful of the additional labor that so many of us do, particularly in environments where we are one of the few, if not the only. Being a person of color, likewise, I think being LGBTQ or a woman, it is like a part-time job sometimes to navigate your workplace, and oftentimes you don't want to take on that emotional labor. But I think if you ask questions respectfully, and part of this is to ask questions respectfully, and part of it is to make sure that you don't have preconceived notions of what that person is. I don't think in a interpersonal interaction, it's much better to ask a question and assume something about someone. It'll work out better for everyone involved. And also understand that people have multiple identities, that you may be asking about one part of their identity, but that's not the whole. If you're API, LGBTQ, multiracial, you may have different gender preferences. These are things that if you do want to learn about somebody, ask appropriate, respectful questions, and make sure you're not coming with preconceived notions around race, ethnicity, gender identity, sexual orientation. And your next question is, but really, how? That is not the way to go.
Thank you so much. Thank you to all of our executives on this panel, and thank you everyone for joining us. I'm going to turn it back to Isabel.
Thank you so much, Michelle, Anna, Bo, Kenrick, for sharing your experiences and expertise with us, for making yourselves vulnerable with your experiences. We are very grateful, and I can tell you all, though you were engaging, weren't able to look at the chats coming in, that folks are equally expressing their thanks to you for sharing those experiences with us. So as I've been saying across the forum, I ask that you please share your feedback with us. Please continue to add questions and comments in the Pathable chat. We'll be collecting those. And this is a conversation that will continue. You'll see more from us, from our partners at Uber, Ascend, and others, right? Continuing these conversations frequently. And so we definitely encourage you to continue the conversation yourself back at your workplaces, and to submit the questions and discomfort that you still have, right? What are the things that we need to answer? What are the things that we need to work on? I know I took a lot out of this panel on how to be a better ally to my AAPI colleagues. And so I'm very grateful to you all for that. Again, we ask for that survey feedback at the bottom of the session, the Pathable agenda page. And thank you all so much. Please join me. I know we're on a webinar and so folks are not on camera, but join me via chat, thanking our panelists for joining us today. Have a great rest of your afternoon, and I will see you in 30 minutes for our closing session.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you. Feel better, Kenrick. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle.